It's actually incredible to think about the sheer weight of what you are doing on a totally average Tuesday morning.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Let's just trace your steps for a second. You walk into a local cafe, right?
Right.
You hand over a slightly crumpled $5 bill across the counter,
Yeah.
and the barista hands you a cup of coffee.
Classic morning routine.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe a few hours later, you're sitting in your desk, you open an email, and you hit reply to formally accept a new job offer.
A huge moment.
Yeah, a huge moment. Or, maybe you do something even more mundane than that. Like a notification pops up on your phone, and you just tap the word update.
Without reading a single syllable.
Right. Without reading any of the 70-page document that flashes on your screen.
Yeah.
You just click it.
We all do it.
We all do. But in every single one of those seemingly harmless moments, you are actually triggering this massive, completely invisible machinery.
It's everywhere.
It is. You are creating legal and moral obligations out of thin air. It's almost like you're casting a spell,
Yeah.
a spell that permanently binds you to another human being, or I guess more likely, to a giant faceless corporation.
Usually a corporation.
Yeah. And the wild part is, most of the time, we don't even realize we're casting that spell. We just do it.
Well, we simply consider it the architecture of modern life. We move through this invisible web of agreements so seamlessly, so routinely, that we just take the underlying mechanics completely for granted.
Completely for granted.
Yeah, we operate on this really basic assumption that a deal is a deal. We assume that the rules governing all those deals are settled, obvious, and mathematically precise.
It's like they were handed down from some mountain of legal certainty.
Exactly. But as we are about to see today, those rules are anything but settled.
Not at all. So for this deep dive, we are pulling from a remarkably dense, highly analytical, and frankly just fascinating entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
It's a great source.
It really is. The subject is the philosophy of contract law.
Mm-hmm.
And our mission today is to peel back that everyday act of making a deal.
To see what's actually under the hood.
Right. We want to uncover the fierce, centuries-old philosophical battles that are raging just underneath the surface of, your morning coffee purchase.
It's a bloodbath down there.
It really is. We are going to explore whether contracts are actually these sacred moral promises, or perhaps they're just cold, calculating economic tools.
Or maybe instruments for societal justice.
Right. Or that.
Yeah.
And eventually we really have to look hard at what it actually means when we blindly click, I agree on the internet.
Which is a whole existential crisis on its own.
Oh, completely. So to truly grapple with this material as our guide today, where should we start?
Well, to really get in the right headspace, you have to picture the space we are entering. Imagine the backdrop of our conversation shifting.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
We are stepping into this grand, mahogany-lined legal library. Picture dust motes floating in the shafts of light,
Very cinematic.
Right. And giant floor-to-ceiling shelves groaning under the weight of heavy, centuries-old theoretical texts.
Okay, I'm there. Why are we in this old library?
Because the reason we need to be in this mental space is that the foundational question we're dealing with, the remarkably simple question of why we are actually bound to our agreements, it is an absolute battleground. The law has simply not made up its mind.
That is wild to me, that the law doesn't even know why it works.
It's true.
Well, let's start with the most intuitive idea in the world then. It's the concept we're all taught when we were children.
To keep your promises.
Exactly. If you say you are going to do something, you have to do it, period. You made a promise. That feels like the absolute bedrock of human interaction.
It does feel that way.
But does the legal system actually operate on this childlike morality? Because when I look at the sources, I see that the Restatement Second of Contract,
which is basically the ultimate rule book for judges.
Right, the rule book. It literally defines a contract as simply a promise or a set of promises for the breach of which the law gives a remedy.
Right.
So it sounds like the law and morality are in perfect harmony there. Charles Freed, who is a major thinker highlighted in the text, champions this exact view.
Yeah, the contract is promise view.
Exactly. He argues that making a promise is essentially a moral invention. It allows you to magically create an obligation where absolutely none existed a moment prior.
And the philosopher Joseph Raz delves deeply into the mechanics of this concept, too. He focuses on what he calls the bare reasons of promising.
Bare reasons, what does that mean?
Well, the proposition here is that morality dictates a promise is binding, regardless of the consequences. It is binding even if absolutely no one relies on your promise.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it's binding even if no one is actively physically hurt by you breaking it. The very act of communicating your intention to be bound is the sole thing that binds you.
Wow. Just the words themselves.
Exactly. But as the sources point out, this raises a profound puzzle, and the philosopher David Hume was actually deeply bothered by this.
I can see why. It feels a bit like, well, like magic.
That's exactly the word Hume used. He looked at the act of promising and wondered how simply uttering a sequence of words could change a person's moral obligations out of thin air.
Right, like how do sound waves leaving your mouth create an invisible chain around your future actions?
He actually went so far as to compare the mystery of making a promise to the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation.
Oh, wow, transubstantiation, like the bread and wine becoming the body and blood.
Yes, exactly. The belief that human intention and ritual can fundamentally alter the invisible metaphysical nature of reality. To Hume, the act of promising seemed almost like this absurd form of sorcery.
I honestly love that comparison. You say, I promise, and poof, the universe is fundamentally altered.
You now carry a duty you didn't have 5 seconds ago.
It feels very clean, very honorable. However, when you look at how the courts actually operate, the legal system seems to clash violently with that pure moral theory.
It completely departs from it, yes.
Because the reality is the law does not enforce every promise you make. Like if contract law is just the enforcement of promises, why can I promise to do a favor for my neighbor, break that promise, and face zero legal consequences?
Right, and this is where the law actively and intentionally departs from moral promising. They use a very specific mechanism called the consideration doctrine.
Consideration. Okay, what is that?
You'll find this in Section 71 of the Restatement. The consideration doctrine dictates that the law generally ignores gratuitous, kindly promises.
Gratuitous meaning like a free gift.
Exactly. Let's say you promise your nephew that you will buy him a very expensive toy for his birthday.
Okay.
Or you promise a friend you will drive them to the airport at 4 in the morning.
Which is a terrible promise to make, by the way.
It's the worst.
Oh.
But if you oversleep, or if you just change your mind and don't buy the toy for your nephew, you are certainly committing a moral wrong.
Sure, I'm being a jerk.
You are acting poorly, but you have not broken a legal contract. The law demands a bargain for exchange.
A bargain. So I have to get something out of it.
Right. Each party's promise has to induce the other party's promise. The famous jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. referred to this as reciprocal conventional inducement.
That is a very fancy way of saying a trade.
It is. You give me something, so I give you something. Without that exchange, without that consideration, your moral promise is legally invisible.
Wait, so is there any scenario where a kindly favor becomes legally binding? What if, say, my friend loses their job because I didn't drive them to the airport and they miss a crucial flight?
There are a few very narrow exceptions. The most prominent one is called promissory estoppel.
Promissory estoppel.
Right. That's a legal doctrine where a court might force you to pay up if someone heavily and reasonably relied on your gratuitous promise to their own severe detriment.
Okay, so if they really got screwed over because they trusted me.
Yes, but that is a rare exception to the rule. The baseline rule is that morality alone is simply not enough to make a promise a contract.
Okay, let's unpack this clash between morality and the law, because I feel like it gets even stranger when we look at the consequences of breaking a contract.
Oh, the remedies, yes.
Right. If a contract truly is a sacred moral promise, logic dictates that the legal system's response to you breaking it would be to say, no, you promised, now do the exact thing you said you were going to do.
Make them perform the action.
Yeah. But reading through these sources, that almost never happens.
Right.
The law doesn't force you to keep your promise. It just makes you pay money.
Yes, the standard remedy in contract law is something called expectation damages. And really understanding the math behind expectation damages is crucial for understanding the underlying philosophy.
Okay, lay the math on me.
Let's step away from textbooks and use a real-world scenario. Let's say I own a vintage car and I promise to sell it to you for $10,000.
Sweet. I love vintage cars.
You are thrilled because
Yeah.
you know a collector across town who will buy it from you tomorrow for $15,000.
Oh, nice. So I'm expecting a $5,000 profit?
Exactly. Now, the day of the sale arrives and I breach the contract. I just completely refuse to hand over the keys.
So I sue you.
You sue me. And if we go to court, the law doesn't just make me give you back any deposit you paid. The law forces me to pay you the $5,000 profit you expected to make.
Really? Even though I never actually had the car?
Right. The law is indirectly enforcing the promise by forcing me, the promiser, to act as an insurance policy for your expected value of the performance.
Okay, I see how that protects my financial position. But honestly, it creates a massive, glaring loophole for people who simply want to break their word.
How so?
Let me float an analogy here to explain what I mean. Imagine you promise to go to a very boring dinner with a friend on a Friday night.
Okay.
But on Thursday, a vastly cooler pony invitation comes along. You sit down and you calculate that the joy of attending the cool party is worth, say, $50 to your personal happiness.
I like putting a dollar amount on happiness.
Right. And you estimate that the disappointment your friend will feel from you canceling is only worth about $20.
So the math is in favor of the new party.
Exactly. So you ditch your friend, you go to the great party, and the next morning you leave a $20 bill on their doorstep to make them whole.
Paying your expectation damages, essentially.
Yes, but you still broke your promise. You still lied. If contracts are fundamentally based on the morality of keeping promises, how can the legal system look at that scenario and say, yep, that's perfectly fine?
Well, the legal system doesn't just say it's perfectly fine. The legal system arguably encourages that exact behavior.
Seriously, encourages it.
Yes. This introduces the concept of the efficient breach.
Efficient breach. Okay, tell me about that.
Let's apply your dinner party math back to the vintage car. I promise to sell it to you for $10,000 and you expect a $5,000 profit.
Right.
But before I hand you the keys, a third buyer approaches me. And this guy offers me $20,000 for the car.
Oh, wow. Double the original price.
The economic incentive, which is built directly into the law, is for me to break my promise to you.
To break it on purpose.
Yes. I sell the car to the new guy for $20,000. I take $5,000 of that and pay you your expectation damages so you get the profit you were hoping for.
So I still get my $5,000.
Right, and I pocket an extra $5,000 in profit for myself.
So everyone wins?
Mathematically, yes. The breach is considered efficient because the call ends up with the person who values it the absolute most. I make more money, and you are theoretically no worse off financially than if the contract had been performed.
But I don't get the car.
Right, but courts will almost never order what is called specific performance.
Which would be forcing you to give me the car.
Exactly. A court order forcing me to physically hand the car over, they just don't do it. They prefer the money damages.
So the contract as promise theory has this giant structural flaw. The theory claims the magic is in the promise, but the law lets you literally buy your way out of that moral obligation whenever you want.
Whenever the math works out, yes.
So maybe the core foundation of a contract isn't the promise itself. Maybe we have to abandon the morality of the promise entirely and look at the consequence of the breach.
Which leads us to the harm-based alternative.
Right. Maybe it is about preventing harm to the person who trusted you.
That is exactly the pivot that many legal theorists make when they realize the promise theory doesn't match reality. If we are uncomfortable with the magical bare reasons of promising, we turn to the harm-based alternative.
Who champions this idea?
The leading contemporary proponent of this view in the sources is T.M. Scanlon.
Okay, Scanlon.
His view essentially argues that contract law shouldn't be its own separate magical category. Instead, it is really just a specialized branch of tort law.
And tort law is all about personal injury, right? Like someone wrongs you and they have to pay to fix it.
Broadly, yes. Torts are about harm. If I carelessly swing a baseball bat and shatter your window, I've committed a tort and I owe you the cost of a new window.
Makes sense. You break it, you buy it.
Scanlon applies this logic directly to contracts through his principle of fidelity. He argues that the underlying moral rule isn't keep your promises. The rule is that you shouldn't manipulate other people.
Oh, I like that.
Or voluntarily lead them to form expectations that will ultimately get them hurt.
So it's about not tricking people into vulnerable positions.
Exactly. If I know you are looking for assurance that I will sell you my car, and I give you that assurance, I am morally bound.
But not because of the magical promise words.
Right. I am not bound because of some magical incantation. I am bound because if I back out, and you've already started clearing space in your garage and buying new tires, my actions have caused you tangible harm.
Okay, that feels incredibly grounded. Instead of I promised, therefore I must perform, the logic becomes I made you rely on me, and if I pull the rug out, you will fall and get hurt. So the law steps in to protect you from the fall.
It's very intuitive.
It is. But there seems to be a massive tension here between how tort law fixes a problem and how contract law fixes a problem.
The tension is severe. The tort analogy breaks down completely when we look at the remedies the court applies.
How so?
Well, tort law is fundamentally fault-based. Its goal is to return the injured person to the status quo ante.
Meaning the state they were in before.
Exactly. The exact state they were in before the wrong occurred. I broke your window, I buy you a window, you are back to zero.
Right, neutral.
But contract liability is strict. It doesn't care if I breach the contract accidentally or on purpose. More importantly, contract law doesn't return you to zero. It enforces the future expectation.
Right. We just established that the law makes me pay expectation damages, the $5,000 in future profit I hope to make on the vintage car.
Yes.
But wait, under Scanlon's harm theory, why would the law do that? What if my actual out-of-pocket reliance costs the real tangible harm I suffered were absolute zero?
Like if you hadn't bought the new tires or cleared the garage?
Exactly. If I haven't actually spent a dime preparing for the car, I haven't been harmed. How can I deserve a future hypothetical profit if contract law is just about preventing actual harm?
You have zeroed in on the fatal flaw of the harm-based theory. If reliance costs are zero, the harm theory simply cannot explain why the court awards expectation damages.
It completely falls apart.
It does, and the sources point out an even more extreme scenario that totally shatters the harm-based theory. It is a phenomenon known in legal philosophy as the bootstrapping puzzle.
The bootstrapping puzzle. I love a good puzzle. What is it?
It asks a very difficult question. What happens if a promise is made, but the person hearing the promise knows for a fact that it is a lie?
Oh, well, if I know you were lying to me when you promised to sell me the car, how can I possibly claim that I relied on your promise?
You can't.
Right, because I never trusted you in the first place, so my trust couldn't have been betrayed.
Exactly. So let's look at how the courts actually handle this. The text highlights a perfect real-world example. It's a case from 1990 called CBS Inc. versus Ziff Davis Publishing Co.
Okay, CBS like the television network.
Yes, exactly. Ziff Davis was selling a magazine business to CBS. In the contract, Ziff Davis made very specific warranties guarantees about how wildly profitable the business was.
Okay, pretty standard business deal so far.
However, CBS was a massive corporation. They did their own independent financial audits before they signed the deal.
Mark.
And CBS realized, before the ink was even dry, that the profitability claims made by Ziff Davis were completely false.
Wait, they knew they were lying.
They literally told the seller, "We have run the numbers, and we do not believe your financial statement."
Oh, wow, so they called them out.
Yes. Yet they went ahead and signed the contract anyway.
Why would they do that?
Well, we'll see in a second. Later, the business tanked, as expected, and CBS sued Ziff Davis for breach of warranty.
Okay, and what does Ziff Davis say?
Ziff Davis went to court and argued exactly what you just suggested. They said, CBS didn't believe us, they didn't rely on our statements, they weren't harmed by trusting us because they actively distrusted us.
Which is completely true. So under a harm-based theory, Ziff Davis should win. CBS wasn't manipulated, they weren't led into a trap, they walked in with their eyes wide open.
Right.
How did the court actually rule?
The court enforced the contract. They ruled in favor of CBS.
You're kidding.
The buyer's total lack of belief did not relieve the seller of their obligations.
But how does that make any sense under a harm theory?
It doesn't. And to understand why the court did this, we have to look back to the legendary judge Learned Hand, who provided the philosophical insight to explain this decades earlier.
Learned Hand. Great name for a judge, by the way.
One of the best. Judge Hand pointed out that a contractual warranty isn't about belief, it is an indemnification policy.
An indemnification policy, meaning like insurance.
Exactly. It is the seller legally stating, I will cover your financial losses if this specific fact proves untrue, regardless of what the buyer actually believes in their heart.
Ah, I see.
This creates the bootstrapping effect. The law itself generates the expectation that a warranty will be enforced, and then it uses that very legal expectation as the reason for enforcing the contract.
It's a loop.
It is a self-fulfilling loop. The law says we enforce this because it's a rule completely detached from preventing any actual psychological reliance or human harm.
A self-fulfilling loop. The law enforces it simply because the law enforces it. That is a really tough pill to swallow if you're looking for, like, a moral foundation. So, if the pure morality theory has holes because it allows efficient breaches, and the harm prevention theory collapses under the bootstrapping puzzle where actual belief doesn't even matter, where does that leave the philosophy of contracts?
We have to shift paradigms entirely.
It seems like we need to strip away the messy human emotions of promises and harm entirely and view this through a much colder lens.
We have to turn to the cold, calculating machine of economic efficiency.
The economists enter the chat.
Exactly. Because the moral and harm-based theories struggle so much with real-world legal doctrine, a group known as lawyer economists approach contracts from a completely utilitarian standpoint.
Utilitarian. So maximum benefit for the most people.
Right. Their entire focus is the pursuit of mutual advantage. To understand their view, we can actually go back to David Hume again.
The transubstantiation guy.
The very same. Aside from his thoughts on magic, Hume realized a fundamental problem of society. For a society to progress, humans need to be able to cooperate. We need to trade.
Obviously.
But humans are inherently self-interested. Without some sort of strict commitment mechanism, everyone has a natural incentive to defect.
To defect, meaning take the money and run.
Exactly, to take the other person's money and run. If we can't trust each other, we can't invest in the future.
We would just be paralyzed. Like, I won't give you my wheat today because I don't trust you to give me your sheep tomorrow.
Precisely. So, in this economic view, a contract isn't sacred. It possesses zero intrinsic moral value. It is merely a tool. It's a power-conferring mechanism designed by society to maximize joint surplus and overall social welfare. It's just the grease in the wheels of capitalism.
Okay, I get that. And I imagine the incredible beauty of this theory, from a purely analytical perspective, is that it perfectly explains all the strange legal quirks that the moral theory struggled with.
It does. It fits the data perfectly. Why does the law encourage efficient breach? The moralist is horrified by it, but the economist looks at the vintage car scenario and says, this is perfect.
Right, because the original buyer gets their $5,000 expected profit.
Yes.
The seller gets an extra $5,000.
Yes.
And the new buyer gets the vintage car they desperately value at $20,000.
Everyone wins. The total wealth of society is just mathematically increased. It is what economists call a Pareto improvement.
A Pareto improvement.
It means at least one person is better off and absolutely no one is worse off.
Wow. Okay, I can see why economists love that.
The economic theory also perfectly explains a bizarre rule regarding penalty clauses.
Okay, I noticed this in the sources, and it really bugged me. Because in a free society, if two grown adults want to sign a contract, shouldn't they be allowed to set whatever terms they want?
You would think so.
Like, what if I say, I will sell you my car, but if I back out, I agree to pay you $1 million penalty? It's my choice to offer that penalty. Why would a court strike that down?
The courts routinely strike them down. And the famous case, Lake River Court versus Carborundum Co., explores exactly why.
Okay, what happened?
Well, when parties agree in advance to a massive punishing fine that is wildly disproportionate to any actual damages, the courts simply refuse to enforce it.
But why? If I agreed to it.
Under the economic theory, the reason is simple. A penalty clause actively discourages efficient breach.
Oh. Because I'd never break the promise.
Right. If I am facing $1 million penalty, I am never going to breach the contract and sell the car to the new buyer who values it at $20,000.
So the car stays with the person who values it less.
Exactly. The penalty traps the asset with the lower valuing user. Society loses out on that extra wealth creation.
That is fascinating.
Furthermore, economists worry that established massive firms might use penalty clauses to collude and create barriers, locking in suppliers and keeping new competitors out of the market.
Like a monopoly tactic.
Yes. So the law steps in and strikes those clauses down just to keep the economy moving efficiently.
Okay, I have to admit, that sounds incredibly elegant. It is like a perfectly balanced equation where human behavior is channeled into maximum productivity.
It's very clean on paper.
But there has to be a catch. Life isn't a spreadsheet.
There is a massive caveat. And to be fair, the most sophisticated economists readily admit it. This wealth maximization theory only works flawlessly in highly idealized models.
How column models?
Specifically, it works best in models involving corporations owned by diversified shareholders.
Diversified shareholders. Let me try an analogy to see if I am grasping how that changes the math.
Go for it.
Imagine a massive multiplayer video game. The developers of the game only care about one metric, the total high score of the entire server.
Yeah.
Now imagine a player who doesn't just control one avatar. They have a tiny stake in the success of every single avatar on the server.
A diversified portfolio of avatars.
Right. So if Avatar A attacks Avatar B and steals all their gold, the player doesn't care. They own stock in Avatar A and Avatar B. The gold just moved from their left pocket to their right pocket.
Right.
As long as the combat generated a little extra experience points for the server overall, the player is happy.
That is a brilliant analogy.
Thanks. So if contract law is built for that player, the diversified shareholder who owns a piece of the breaching company and the victim company, then efficient breach is painless.
They are completely insulated from the friction of the individual loss.
Exactly. But how can this model possibly account for you and me? We aren't diversified corporate portfolios. We are flesh and blood people. If a landlord efficiently breaches a lease to get a higher-paying tenant, I don't own stock in the landlord's company. I just get evicted. How does this theory account for fairness?
It doesn't.
It just ignores it.
Yes. And that raises a critical question, which forms the core of the critique against wealth maximization.
Who made this critique?
The philosopher Ronald Dworkin argued forcefully against the economic approach. He drew a sharp line between what a legislature should do and what a judge should do.
Okay, what's the difference in his eyes?
Dworkin said that politicians who are accountable to the broad public should absolutely be passing laws that maximize broad social efficiency.
That makes sense. That's their job.
But when a judge is sitting in a courtroom staring at two actual specific people in a dispute, the judge's job is not to engineer aggregate social wealth.
What is their job then?
The judge's job is to look at the established rights of the specific parties in front of them and decide what is interpersonally fair.
Right, to find justice for those two people.
Yes. To sacrifice one person's rights just to make the overall market slightly wealthier violates the basic premise of justice.
That is a really strong argument. And beyond the philosophical role of a judge, isn't there a fundamental bias in how these economists even measure what counts as wealth or efficiency?
A profound bias. Zachary Liskow and other theorists point out the fatal flaw in the math here. Economists generally measure societal welfare by looking at preference satisfaction, basically. Are people getting what they want?
Sure.
And how do they measure what people want? They use a metric called willingness to pay.
Willingness to pay, meaning how much cash will you drop on this item?
Exactly. But willingness to pay is entirely dependent on your background wealth.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Imagine a scenario where a devastating drought hits a town and there is one bottle of water left.
Okay.
I am a billionaire and I want the water to wash my car.
A terrible use of water in a drought.
You have $5 to your name and you are literally dying of thirst. I am willing to pay $10,000 for that water. You are only willing to pay $5.
Because that's all I have.
Right. If the legal system blindly follows the metric of willingness to pay to determine where resources should efficiently go, it will conclude that I should get the water to wash my car.
That is insane. That is completely biased.
It is. The entire legal framework becomes inherently biased in favor of the wealthy, disguising extreme inequality as objective economic efficiency.
That is a terrifying thought when you realize how much of our legal policy is driven by economic analysis.
It's pervasive.
And speaking of the real world and the vulnerability of everyday people, how do any of these high-minded theories apply to our actual daily lives?
They often don't map well at all.
Right. We have spent all this time talking about autonomous individuals making sacred moral promises and rational economic actors carefully maximizing their surplus. But let's be fiercely honest about how you and I actually enter into contracts today.
You mean the screens?
The screens. We blindly click, I agree on software terms of service. We rapidly sign digital pads at the rental car counter, while a line of angry people glare at us.
Just trying to get the keys.
Exactly. We sign unread, densely packed standard forms at the doctor's office while we are sick and just want to see a doctor. This brings us to what the sources call the click-to-agree phenomenon.
Yes.
I look at this as the existential crisis of the modern contract.
It is an existential crisis. Specifically in the philosophy of action, it is a crisis of intentionality.
Intentionality. Breaking that down, it means having the intent to do something.
Right. Let's trace the logic. Orthodox contract law, going all the way back to our first theory of contract as promise, relies heavily on the idea of promissory intent.
Right. The magical words, you have to mean them.
Yes. The moral justification for holding you to an obligation is that you actively manifested an intention to be bound.
Okay.
But standard form contracts, especially digital end-user license agreements, are entered into without any bespoke drafting.
Their negotiation at all.
None. And most importantly, they are entered into without the consumer reading a single word. So the legal philosopher stares at this and asks, how can a court possibly find promissory intent in a thoughtless act?
Exactly. The software company knows perfectly well that I did not read the 70-page agreement before I downloaded their app.
They absolutely know.
They hired designers to make the I agree button bright blue and massive so I would instinctively click it and move on with my life. So how can a judge look at my mindless click and declare, ah, yes, here we have a deeply considered manifestation of mutual assent?
It's a huge leap. And to truly understand how bizarre this legal posture is, we have to look at how the law handles other situations where intent is entirely missing.
Like what other situations?
The law actually does have a distinct category for obligations that arise without true promissory intent. They are called quasi-contracts.
Quasi-contracts, like fake contracts.
Sort of like implied contracts. The classic legal textbook example is a case like Bailey v. West, which involved the boarding of a lame horse.
Boarding a horse without permission.
Right, taking care of it when the owner was unknown. But the easiest way to conceptualize a quasi-contract for most people is the medical emergency.
Oh, okay, let's hear that one.
Imagine an unconscious patient is rushed into the emergency room. A surgeon performs a complex, life-saving procedure.
Okay.
The patient never consented. They were completely unconscious. They manifested zero intent. But a week later, they get a bill.
And they have to pay it.
Yes. The law will impose a quasi-contractual duty on that patient to pay the surgeon. It is based on the hypothetical, reasonable assumption that the patient would have consented to the debt if they were awake in order to save their own life.
That makes total sense. It's a matter of basic fairness to the doctor. It prevents the patient from being unjustly enriched by receiving free surgery.
Yes. But here's the fascinating discrepancy. The legal system absolutely refuses to put standard form consumer contracts into this quasi-contract category.
Why not?
Good question. It refuses to say, well, the consumer didn't really intend to agree, but it's fair enough. Instead, the law insists on treating your mindless click on a website as a bona fide, fully intentional, traditional agreement.
Even though they know I didn't read it.
It treats it the exact same way it treats two massive corporations negotiating a merger for 6 months.
That is just, it's absurd.
And this legal fiction completely falls apart when you expose it to the philosophy of mind. Michael Bratman, a prominent philosopher of action, developed a highly influential theory of intention.
What does Bratman say?
He argues that an intention isn't just a vague wish or a passive state. An intention is a unique, future-directed mental state that actively guides your behavior and frames your reasoning.
Active behavior guiding mental state.
Okay. So when you download a flashlight app on your phone, do you possess an active behavior-guiding mental state regarding a forced arbitration clause buried on page 40 of the Terms of Service?
Of course not. The only intention I have when I click I agree is the desperate intention to make the annoying pop-up box disappear so I can turn on the flashlight.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? When you break it down like that, clicking I agree feels like signing a blank check, putting on a blindfold, and handing it to a corporate lawyer in a dark alley.
That's a very vivid image, but it's accurate.
It honestly feels like the entire legal system is just relying on a massive, convenient lie. They know we don't actually intend to agree to the terms, but they pretend we do. Simply because, if they admitted the truth, the entire digital economy would grind to a halt overnight.
You have reached the exact conclusion that many skeptical legal scholars reach. It is a necessary fiction for mass commerce.
A necessary fiction.
But some theorists are trying to rescue the concept. Randy Barnett, for instance, suggests we need to move away from a strict promise theory and adopt a consent-based theory. Perhaps the bar for intentionality shouldn't be so high.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, other theorists propose what is known as the dispositional theory.
Dispositional theory.
This argument concedes that you do not have an active mental state intending to be bound by the specific terms, because obviously you haven't read them.
Right.
But they argue you do have a general unconscious disposition to be bound by whatever the standard, normal commercial terms happen to be in that specific context.
I see. So the theory is that I am essentially saying, I don't know what the rules are, but I broadly accept whatever the quote-unquote normal rules are for buying a flashlight app.
Yes, it's a blanket acceptance of the norm. However, this philosophical rescue attempt runs headfirst into empirical reality.
I'll go.
Because it is one thing to debate intention in a library, it is another to test it in the real world. Behavioral researchers like Zev Eigen have actually conducted studies on how ordinary people interact with contracts.
And what did they find?
The data is incredibly revealing. It shows that people only truly feel a sense of moral or psychological obligation to comply with a contract when they have actively participated in negotiating it. When a boilerplate form is just shoved in their face on a screen, the internal sense of duty vanishes. Without participation, there is no psychological buy-in.
Which completely tracks with human nature. If I didn't have a voice in making the rules, why would I feel morally bound to respect them?
Exactly.
And that lack of a voice brings us to the final and perhaps most volatile section of our deep dive. If we are trapped in these unread click-wrap contracts, and if these contracts are completely dictated by massive corporations who hold all the bargaining power,
Which they do.
who ensures that the pie is divided fairly, does contract law actually care about inequality?
This is where the philosophy of contract law bleeds over into political philosophy and the ethics of distributive justice.
Oh boy. Okay, distributive justice.
Historically, contract law has been extremely hesitant to intervene in a deal based purely on economic inequality. The courts generally believe that adults should be free to make bad deals.
Freedom of contract.
Right. However, there is a safety valve built into the system. It's called the doctrine of unconscionability.
Unconscionability.
This is the tool courts use when a contract is so shockingly, overwhelmingly unfair that they simply refuse to enforce it.
Wow, okay, so they do have a safety valve.
They do, but the hurdle to prove unconscionability is incredibly high because the doctrine is divided into two strict parts: procedural and substantive.
How do those two parts differ?
Procedural unconscionability is entirely about abuses in the bargaining process itself.
Like what?
Was there fraud? Was there extreme duress? Did a sophisticated corporation intentionally exploit a consumer's lack of education or their inability to read the language? It looks at how the contract is formed.
Okay, that's procedural. What about substantive?
Substantive unconscionability, on the other hand, is about the actual terms of the deal itself. Are the terms oppressively one-sided? Is the price astronomically, unjustifiably high?
So it's about the fairness of the outcome.
Yes. Now, for a very brief moment in modern legal history, it looked like courts might use substantive unconscionability alone to strike down contracts simply to protect the poor.
Really? Just based on price?
Yes. In a famous 1969 case, Jones v. Star Credit Corp., a court struck down an installment contract for a freezer.
A freezer.
A freezer. A low-income consumer bought a freezer that had a retail value of roughly $300. But with the exorbitant financing terms they were given, they ended up agreeing to pay over $1,200.
That is pure robbery.
The court stepped in and essentially said, this price is just too high for someone in poverty. It looked like the law might try to right economic wrongs directly.
Wait, let me stop you there. Does that mean if I buy a car with a terrible interest rate today, the court will tear up the contract because the dealer charged me too much?
No, because the courts aggressively retreated from the Jones standard shortly after.
They backed off.
They backed off hard. Today, almost all jurisdictions require a strong showing of both procedural and substantive unconscionability.
So I have to prove both.
Yes. You cannot walk into court and simply show that a deal was terrible for a poor person. You have to prove that the corporation also engaged in some shady, abusive tactic during the bargaining process to trap them. The law, as it stands today, generally does not make distributive justice leveling the playing field of society a freestanding requirement for a valid contract.
And this touches on a massive, overarching political tension. I want to pause here and be very clear with everyone listening. We are about to look at two deeply opposed political philosophies regarding how wealth should be shared in society.
Very opposed.
We are not taking a side here. Our goal is purely impartial reporting on the source material to show you the vastly different lenses through which legal scholars view human exchange.
It's important to understand both sides.
Exactly. So let's set up the heavyweight bout. On one side of the spectrum, we have the egalitarian view of contracts.
Yes. This view is heavily influenced by the philosopher John Rawls, and further down the spectrum by Marxist critiques.
Okay, what is the Rawlsian view?
The Rawlsian view argues that contracts and property laws aren't just private matters between two isolated people. Contract law is part of the basic structure of society.
The basic structure.
Right. Because this structure pervasively influences everyone's life chances from birth, it must be designed to prioritize the interests of the worst-off members of society.
So the law has a duty to help the vulnerable.
Yes. They argue that a completely unregulated free market simply allows those who are already wealthy and advantaged to capture all the extra value created by cooperation, thereby maintaining and deepening unjustified inequality.
And what about the Marxist critique? You mentioned that goes further.
It does. The Marxist critique argues that in a capitalist society with vast wealth disparities, private exchange is inherently exploitative of labor.
Exploitative.
From this perspective, true, uncoerced consent is actually impossible. If one side controls the capital and the means of survival, and the other side must sign the contract just to eat and pay rent, the agreement is structurally coercive, regardless of what the paper says.
Okay, so through the egalitarian lens, the system itself is skewed, and the law needs to actively correct those imbalances to make contracts truly fair.
That's the egalitarian position, yes.
Now, on the completely opposite side, we have the libertarian or voluntarist view, which is most famously associated with the philosopher Robert Nozick. How does he look at inequality in contracts?
Nozick's core concept is justice in transfer.
Justice and transfer.
His argument is remarkably straightforward, and it completely rejects the need for ongoing wealth redistribution.
Okay, how does he justify that?
Nozick argues that if the background conditions are fair, meaning no one is actively stealing and no one is committing outright fraud, and an exchange is strictly procedurally voluntary, then whatever outcome results from that exchange is perfectly just. Period.
Even if it leads to huge inequality.
It does not matter to Nozick if the exchange results in massive structural inequality over time. It does not matter if one person gets 99% of the benefit from the contract and the other person only gets 1%.
Wow.
If they both agreed to the terms without being physically forced or overtly lied to, the state has absolutely no moral right to interfere and redistribute the wealth. To interfere, in this view, is a violation of human liberty.
Those are two incredibly stark ways of looking at human freedom.
They are fundamentally irreconcilable.
Let's take these grand political theories and bring them down to a practical reality. Let's talk about the actual surplus.
A surplus, yes. This is where the rubber meets the road.
The surplus is the extra value that is created out of thin air when two people cooperate. I love this analogy from the texts. Let's say you and I decide to bake a pie together.
Sounds delicious.
Right. You brought the apples, I brought the crust. Because we cooperated, we've created a pie that neither of us could have possibly made alone.
We needed each other.
Exactly. But now the pie is sitting on the table. How do we slice it fairly? Does the person who brought the apples get half? Do they get 3/4 because apples are currently more expensive than flour? How does philosophy solve the math of the pie?
Well, the sources outline a few specific mechanics for slicing that pie, moving away from pure voluntarism to ideas of moral desert.
Moral desert, like what you deserve.
Exactly. One highly analytical approach is to divide the surplus based on marginal product.
Marginal product, what does that mean?
The theory here is that you should be rewarded based on the exact calculable amount your specific input raised the value of the final product.
So if my crust added exactly $2 of value, I get $2.
Right. But philosophers immediately identify a huge problem with this. How much of your profit is due to your actual hard work, and how much is just scarcity rent?
Scarcity rent.
Scarcity rent is a windfall profit you receive simply because you possess a rare talent or rare resources due to the brute luck of the genetic or geographic lottery.
Oh, like luck.
Yes. If you happen to be the only person in town who inherited an apple orchard, you can demand 90% of the pie. Many philosophers argue you don't morally deserve that scarcity rent because you didn't earn your luck.
You just inherited it. So marginal product gets very messy because it's impossible to untangle someone's actual effort from their sheer luck.
Exactly.
What is another way to slice the surplus?
The philosopher David Gauthier proposed a mathematical solution based on the ratio of relative benefit.
Ratio of relative benefit. That sounds complicated.
It's not too bad. It tries to find an objective fairness based on what people give up. Here is the specific numerical example from the text.
Okay, let's hear the math.
Imagine you and I enter into a contract, and together we generate a $10 surplus.
We made 10 extra bucks.
Now, if we hadn't cooperated, what were our alternatives? Let's say my best outside option, doing something else without you, would have made me $3.
Okay.
Your best outside option would have made you $4.
So I had a slightly better alternative.
Gauthier suggests we divide the $10 surplus based on the 6-to-7 ratio of what we gave up by choosing to cooperate with each other instead of taking our outside options.
Okay, wait, let me process that.
The idea is that everyone gets a share proportionate to their potential for benefiting from the exchange. It ensures that cooperation remains highly rational for both parties, rather than allowing one party to leverage their power to take 99% of the surplus.
I follow the math, but honestly, even that feels a bit cold. It feels like a game theory equation you just program into a computer.
It is very mechanical.
Are we just calculating machines trying to maximize our ratio? Is there a way to view slicing the pie that actually accounts for us being social, empathetic creatures?
There is, actually, and it provides a wonderful counter-narrative to all this cold math. It comes from a sociological observation by Ian McNeill.
Okay, what did McNeil observe?
McNeill didn't just study abstract models, he looked at actual repeat commercial markets. He studied industries where people do business together over and over again for decades.
Like supply chains or local vendors?
Yes, and he noticed the emergence of what he called gift-giving norms.
Gift giving in business.
Yes. In these tight-knit markets, parties intentionally leave money on the table. They do not ruthlessly claim every last cent of the surplus they are mathematically or legally entitled to.
Really? Why would they do that?
A seller will give an unprompted discount to a loyal buyer who is having a bad quarter. A buyer will completely overlook a minor delay in shipping without demanding damages.
Just to be nice.
Well, they share the surplus generously to build social solidarity and deep trust. They do this because they know that maintaining a healthy, resilient human relationship is infinitely more valuable in the long run than winning a single negotiation.
Leaving money on the table to build trust.
Yeah.
It almost brings us full circle, doesn't it?
It really does.
Back to the idea that a contract isn't just a cold legal machine or an economic equation, but a fundamental human relationship based on keeping your word and trusting each other.
Exactly right.
We have covered an unbelievable amount of ground today. We started with the ancient, almost magical mystery of making a promise and whether the law actually cares about your moral soul.
The bare reasons of promising.
Right. And then we watched that morality get dismantled by the cold equations of economic efficiency and the bizarre concept of the efficient breach.
The dinner party analogy.
Yes, paying your friend $20 to ditch them. Then we stared into the abyss of the modern digital economy, where every I agree click you make is arguably a giant legal fiction propping up a system of thoughtless acts.
The click-to-agree crisis.
And finally, we waded into the grand political debates over who actually deserves the wealth that we create when we choose to cooperate. Slicing the pie.
That's a lot to think about.
So, the next time you swipe your credit card, or click accept on a software update, or hand that crumpled $5 bill to the barista for your morning coffee, just remember, you aren't just buying a drink or downloading an app. You are actively participating in a massive legal architecture that has divided the greatest philosophers for centuries.
And if we look to the horizon, building on everything we have discussed about intention and thoughtless acts, there is a lingering thought I want to leave you with.
Oh, I love a lingering thought. Lay it on us.
Right now, we humans are the ones mindlessly clicking I agree on standard forms, but we are rapidly approaching a near future where our personal AI assistants will be the ones navigating the web for us.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Your AI will negotiate terms, accept cookies, and click I agree with corporate AIs in the background, entirely without your direct knowledge or active mental state.
That's already starting to happen.
Exactly. The philosopher Immanuel Kant suggested that a contract is fundamentally an act of the united choice of two persons.
Two persons.
If our legal system is already struggling so profoundly with human intentionality, what happens to the very soul of contract law when the persons are completely removed from the transaction? Does the law of agreement survive when there is no human mind left to agree?
What happens when two algorithms make a promise? That is a terrifying and brilliant question to end on. A huge thank you to everyone joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning those invisible rules that govern your world. We'll catch you next time.